The American frontier in the early 1800s was not a place for the weak. It was a land of endless wilderness, rivers that swallowed men whole, mountains that shattered bones, and forests alive with predators that would strike without warning. But in this world of unforgiving danger, a single man would etch his name into legend. His name was Hugh Glass. And his story is one of betrayal, unimaginable pain, and the sheer will to survive. Viewer discretion is advised. This story contains graphic descriptions of violence, animal attacks, and human suffering. The year is 1823. The Missouri River twists its way across the wild plains, carrying with it a crew of fur trappers working under General William Henry Ashley. These men are part of the famed Ashley's 100, hardened mountain men who live by their rifles, knives, and endurance. Among them is Hugh Glass, a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered and weathered by years of hardship. Not much is known about his early life, though whispers say he once sailed with pirates before turning to the fur trade. Whatever his past, he has the look of a man who has seen death and intends to outrun it. As the trappers move westward into the Dakota Territory, they know danger surrounds them. The Arikara warriors watch from the shadows, hostile after recent bloody clashes. Food is scarce, the weather harsh, but the most immediate threat comes not from man, but from the wilderness itself. One morning, the expedition halts along the Grand River in what is now South Dakota. The men set up camp, smoke rising into the crisp air. While others rest, Glass shoulders his flintlock rifle and ventures out alone. He moves quietly, a hunter at home in the wild. Every sound is familiar: the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of a hawk. His eyes scan for tracks: deer, elk, anything that might feed the camp. But what he finds instead is something else. Ahead, in a thicket of chokecherry bushes, he spots two small grizzly bear cubs pawing at berries. Instantly, his instincts flare. He knows what this means. If the cubs are here, the mother is close, and she is already watching. The forest explodes with sound. From behind the brush, a massive grizzly bear rears up on its hind legs, towering above Glass. With a roar like thunder, she charges. Glass raises his rifle, too late. The bear slams into him, knocking the weapon from his hands. Her claws rake across his back, tearing flesh to the bone. He screams, stabbing wildly with his knife, but the bear's jaws clamp onto his shoulder, shaking him like prey. The sound of bones cracking fills the air. Glass fights with desperate fury, plunging his blade again and again into the beast's side. The grizzly roars, mauling him further. Just as his strength begins to fade, the other trappers arrive, drawn by his cries. Gunfire erupts. Bullets tear into the bear until finally she collapses. But Hugh Glass is barely alive. His body is shredded, his leg broken, his ribs smashed. The earth beneath him is slick with blood. The men gather around, horrified. His face is nearly torn off, his scalp hanging loose. He can barely breathe. By every account, he should already be dead. They carry him back to camp, laying him on a stretcher of branches. The expedition's leader, Andrew Henry, knows the situation is grim. Glass cannot travel. Every step the party takes with him will slow them down, put all their lives at risk. Yet leaving him outright feels unthinkable. Henry makes a decision. 2 men will stay behind with Glass until he dies, then bury him. The rest will move on. The volunteers are John Fitzgerald, a hardened, self-serving trapper, and Jim Bridger, barely a teenager, new to the frontier. And so, as the expedition disappears into the forest, Hugh Glass is left in their care, bleeding, broken, and hovering at the edge of death. The forest around the Grand River was eerily quiet in the days following the attack. Smoke curled from the small fire that Fitzgerald and Bridger kept alive. At its edge lay Hugh Glass, broken almost beyond recognition. His face was swollen, his skin torn to ribbons. Buzzing flies gathered around the wounds despite their best efforts to wave them away. His breath rattled in his chest like dry leaves in the wind. "Every hour," Fitzgerald muttered. "He won't last till morning." Yet somehow morning always came, and Hugh Glass was still alive. Bridger, barely 19, watched Glass with wide eyes. He had never seen a man cling to life so stubbornly, At night, he whispered prayers over the broken trapper. "Don't worry, Mr. Glass," Bridger murmured one evening. "We'll see you through." Fitzgerald scoffed, spitting into the fire. "You don't understand, boy. He's dead already. Just doesn't know it yet. We stay here, we'll be dead with him." Bridger's face tightened. "Captain Henry said we bury him proper. That's our duty." Fitzgerald leaned closer, his voice low and sharp. "Our duty is to survive. You think the Arikara won't find us out here? You think wolves won't? We waste time on a corpse, we might as well dig our own graves too." The boy turned away, but Fitzgerald's words burrowed into his mind. Days bled into one another. Fitzgerald and Bridger fed Glass broth made from roots and scraps of meat. Sometimes they dripped water between his cracked lips. But Glass showed no sign of dying. His chest rose and fell, stubborn as a mountain. His eyes, half shut, would sometimes flicker open, the faintest spark of awareness within them. Bridger felt haunted by that gaze, as though Glass was trying to speak without words. "Don't you dare leave me." Meanwhile, Fitzgerald grew restless, pacing the camp like a wolf in a cage. "This is madness," he snarled one morning. "The captain paid us extra to watch him till he died, but what if he don't? You want to sit here till winter takes us?" Bridger hesitated. "Maybe he'll recover enough to move." Fitzgerald laughed bitterly. "Move? Boy, look at him. He couldn't crawl a yard if the devil himself was biting his heels." One night Fitzgerald made his move. He shook Bridger awake, his face hard in the moonlight. "I'm done waiting," he hissed. "We leave at dawn. We'll dig a hole, lay him in it, and catch up to Henry before the cut our throats." Bridger's voice cracked. "But he's still alive." Fitzgerald grabbed the boy's collar. "Listen to me. He's a dead man breathing. If you want to die with him, stay, but I'm not wasting my life here." Bridger trembled. Deep inside, every instinct screamed that abandoning a man like this was wrong, but fear is a powerful master, and so, against his heart, he agreed. At dawn, the two men dug a shallow pit beside Glass. Fitzgerald took Glass's rifle, knife, and gear, essentials no man could leave behind. They placed his barely breathing body into the grave, covered him with a thin layer of earth and brush, and whispered the Lord's Prayer. Then they walked away. For most men, that would have been the end. But Hugh Glass was not most men. Buried in a shallow grave, half-conscious, his body shredded and his spirit flickering like a dying flame, he did not surrender. Hours passed. The sounds of his companions faded into the forest. And slowly, with movements that must have torn him apart, Hugh Glass began to claw his way out of the earth. He rose from his grave like a ghost, barely able to breathe, but alive. Alone. The betrayal cut as deep as the bear's claws. His so-called brothers had left him for dead. They had stolen his rifle, his knife, his fire. In this wilderness, that was a death sentence. But Glass swore to himself through broken teeth, "I will not die here. I will live, and I will have my vengeance." That night, under a cold blanket of stars, Hugh Glass began his crawl. He could not walk. His leg was shattered, his ribs stabbed with every breath. But with his elbows and hands, he pulled himself forward inch by agonizing inch. Every root, every rock scraped his torn flesh. Every movement sent fire through his nerves, yet he moved, one drag forward, another, then another. Behind him lay betrayal and death. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of wilderness, but Hugh Glass had chosen his path. He would crawl until his body gave out, or until he lived to see revenge. The first days of Hugh Glass's crawl were a blur of agony. With no weapons, no fire, and no food, he pulled his shredded body through the wilderness, dragging himself across pine needles and rocks. Each movement tore open wounds that should have killed him. His broken leg trailed uselessly behind. His ribs ground like splintered wood with every breath. And yet, he moved. Glass fixed his eyes on the horizon and clawed forward, not for miles, not even for yards, but for inches. Hunger gnawed at him like a second predator. He had nothing but the wild itself to sustain him. At first, he ate berries plucked from low branches. When he found a patch of wild chokecherries, he devoured them, despite their bitterness. Later, he dug at roots with his bare hands, chewing them raw. He snapped open insects and grubs, swallowing them whole. His wounds festered. The gashes on his back oozed pus, and the stench of rot clung to him. Maggots began to crawl within the torn flesh. Any ordinary man would have begged for death. Hugh Glass only clenched his teeth, whispering through cracked lips, "Not today." When he reached the Cheyenne River, Glass collapsed at its banks. His throat was so dry that swallowing water felt like swallowing knives. But he drank until his belly ached, then lay half submerged, letting the current cool his burning flesh. At times he let the water carry him, drifting like a broken log. The river became his ally, moving him faster than his broken body could manage on land. But rivers were dangerous too. Once, as he drifted, he saw the glint of eyes on the shore, a wolf pack pacing him, hungry, waiting for him to falter. One night, weak and trembling, Glass smelled blood in the air. Crawling closer, he saw wolves tearing into the carcass of a freshly killed bison calf. Their snarls echoed in the darkness. Glass's stomach ached with hunger so fierce it felt like fire. He knew he would die if he did not eat. With a raw cry, he dragged himself toward the kill, waving his arms and screaming. The wolves turned on him, eyes gleaming, teeth bared. But Glass, raving with desperation, hurled rocks and roared like an animal himself. For reasons known only to fate, the wolves scattered into the night, and Hugh Glass fell upon the carcass. He tore raw meat with his teeth, swallowing great strips until his belly was full. Blood smeared his face, his chest. It was the first true meal he'd had since the bear. The meat gave him strength, but infection gnawed at his mind. Fever set in, and with it, hallucinations. He dreamed of his past, his days as a sailor, the endless seas, the faces of men long dead. He dreamed of firelight and shadows, of Fitzgerald's cold eyes, of Bridger's trembling hands. Sometimes he saw the bear again, looming over him, claws dripping with blood. He would wake screaming, clutching at wounds that had never stopped bleeding. But even in his madness, a single thought anchored him. Live, keep moving, live. Days turned into weeks. Glass crawled through rain and sun, across forests and plains. He slept beneath fallen logs, drank from streams, and shivered through freezing nights. When he found wild plums, he gorged until his stomach cramped. When insects bit, he crushed them and smeared their bodies across his wounds, numbing the pain. Step by agonizing step, he moved westward, toward Fort Kiowa, where men, food, and safety might be found. It was more than survival now. It was vengeance that drove him on. He would find Fitzgerald and Bridger. He would make them pay. One day, near collapse, Glass was discovered by a band of friendly Lakota Sioux. They did not kill him, though they could have. Instead, they saw the suffering in his eyes and took pity. They gave him food, warm broth that soothed his ravaged stomach. They treated his wounds, pressing maggots into the gashes so they would eat away the dead flesh. To Glass, it was agony. But it also saved his life. With their help, he regained enough strength to walk with a crude crutch. His crawl was over. His journey, however, was not. Weeks after being abandoned in a shallow grave, Hugh Glass hobbled into Fort Kiowa. The men there stared in shock. They had heard he was dead. By every natural law, he should have been. But here he was, gaunt, scarred, limping, but alive, alive, and burning with vengeance. The legend of Hugh Glass had begun. When Hugh Glass stumbled into Fort Kiowa, the men there froze as if they had seen a ghost. His skin was pale, stretched thin over bones. His hair hung in matted tangles. His face was a ruin of scars, one eye swollen nearly shut. He leaned on a crude crutch, dragging his broken body step by step toward the wooden gates. A hush fell over the fort. Word had spread weeks earlier that Glass was dead. Fitzgerald and Bridger had sworn it themselves. Yet here he was, a man who had clawed his way out of his own grave. One trapper whispered, "That's him. That's Hugh Glass." Another crossed himself, muttering, "No man should be alive after what happened." But Hugh Glass was alive, and he wanted vengeance. Inside the fort, Glass was given food and rest. For weeks he lay in a bunk, feverish and shaking, while his body knitted itself back together. The scars would never fade, but strength began to return to his arms, to his legs, to his heart. At night he stared at the ceiling beams, replaying the moment Fitzgerald and Bridger left him in that shallow grave. He remembered the feel of the earth on his face, the sound of their footsteps fading, the emptiness. The anger kept him alive. By the time he could walk without the crutch, he had made his decision. He would hunt them both down. First, Glass tracked down Jim Bridger, the younger of the two. Bridger was little more than a boy, but Glass burned with rage at the betrayal. Weeks of travel brought him to another outpost, where he finally found the youth. Bridger froze when he saw him, his face going pale, his lips trembling. Mr. Glass," the boy stammered. "I thought you—" "You thought I was dead," Glass growled, his voice a rasp of gravel. He stepped closer, his hand on the hilt of his knife. Bridger backed away, tears welling in his eyes. "It wasn't my choice. Fitzgerald made me. He said the Ree would find us, that we'd both die if we stayed. I swear to you, I never wanted to leave you." For a long moment, Glass said nothing. His scarred face was unreadable. The room held its breath. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand. "You're young," Glass muttered. "Too young to carry that guilt." Fitzgerald forced your hand. "You'll live, but you'll remember what you did." Bridger wept with relief. Glass turned away. His vengeance was not for the boy, it was for Fitzgerald. Tracking Fitzgerald was more difficult. The older trapper had vanished into the frontier, leaving behind little but rumors. Some said he had joined another trapping party. Others claimed he had enlisted in the U.S. Army. Glass followed every whisper, every trail, riding across rivers, through forests, and over endless plains. His body screamed with pain, but his fury carried him forward. Finally, word reached him. Fitzgerald was stationed at Fort Atkinson, a U.S. military stronghold. Glass's fury burned hotter. Army or no army, Fitzgerald would not escape him. When Glass arrived at Fort Atkinson, the soldiers there barred his way. "You can't lay a hand on Fitzgerald," the officer told him. "He's under Army protection. Harm him and you'll hang." Glass clenched his fists, the rage boiling inside him. He demanded to see Fitzgerald. At last, the man was brought forward. Fitzgerald stepped into the open, wearing the uniform of a soldier. For a moment, the two men locked eyes. Glass's scarred face twisted with fury. Fitzgerald smirked faintly, as if daring him to try. The knife trembled in Glass's hand. Every muscle screamed for blood, but the soldiers stood nearby, rifles ready. One wrong move, and Hugh Glass would be the one buried in a shallow grave. Glass stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "You stole my rifle. You stole my knife. You left me to die like an animal." Fitzgerald's smirk faltered, just slightly. Glass shoved the blade back into its sheath. "I should kill you, but I won't hang for a rat like you." Then he turned his back and walked away, leaving Fitzgerald pale and shaken. For Hugh Glass, the moment was bittersweet. His vengeance had slipped through his fingers. Fitzgerald would live. But deep inside, Glass knew he had already won. He had survived the grizzly. He had survived betrayal. He had crawled 200 miles through wilderness that should have killed him 10 times over. And now Fitzgerald would spend the rest of his life knowing the man he left for dead had come back to stare him in the eye. Sometimes, survival is the sharpest revenge of all. After leaving Fort Atkinson, Hugh Glass tried to return to the life he knew best, the life of a trapper, hunter, and wanderer of the wilderness. But he was no longer the same man who had set out with General Ashley's expedition. The bear's claws and the scars of betrayal had carved something deeper into him, an unshakable restlessness. He joined trapping expeditions again, floating down rivers, stalking beaver streams, and crossing endless plains. Yet wherever he went, people whispered his name. "This is Hugh Glass," they would say. "The man who crawled 200 miles after a grizzly tore him apart. The man who came back from the dead." He had become a living legend, though in the quiet hours by a campfire, Glass felt more like a ghost. But the wilderness was still dangerous. The Arikara, the same people whose fury had once scattered Ashley's men, were never far from Hugh Glass's path. In 1833, nearly 10 years after the grizzly attack, Glass joined another trapping expedition along the frozen banks of the Yellowstone River. The land was bleak. the snow deep, the silence heavy. One morning, as the trappers moved along the icy banks, the Arikara struck again. Muskets cracked. War cries echoed through the trees. Arrows sliced the air. Chaos exploded around the men. Some ran for the river. Others fell where they stood. Hugh Glass fought fiercely, rifle in hand, but he was no longer the unscarred warrior of his youth. The years and the wounds had taken their toll. In the snow and smoke, an arrow pierced his body. Another musket ball tore into him. He collapsed onto the frozen ground. The man who had survived the impossible, the man who had defied death itself, finally met his end in the wilderness he had walked for so long. The other trappers fled, chased down the riverbank by the war cries of the Arikara. When they looked back, Hugh Glass was gone, his body claimed by the snow and silence. There was no grave, no marker, no cairn of stones, only the whisper of the wind across the Yellowstone and the endless hush of falling snow. For a man like Hugh Glass, perhaps that was fitting. He had belonged to the wilderness all along. But death did not end Hugh Glass's story. The trappers who had known him carried his tale from one fire to the next, from fort to fort, until the name Hugh Glass became a kind of myth. Stories grew with every telling. Some said he had fought off wolves with his bare hands. Others claimed he had crawled not 200 miles but 500. Still others swore he had killed the bear with nothing but a knife in his rage. The truth mattered less than the legend. Hugh Glass had become something bigger than a man. He was the embodiment of frontier survival, the will to endure, the fury to keep moving when every force of nature said stop. In time, Glass's story moved beyond the camps of trappers. Writers picked it up, spinning it into dime novels, folk tales, and eventually films. The details blurred, but the heart of the story remained. A man, broken and abandoned, who refused to die. To this day, the legend of Hugh Glass lingers. In every survival story, in every tale of grit and endurance, his shadow is there, the scarred man crawling through the wilderness, clawing his way back from the grave. Hugh Glass was not a saint. He was not a hero in the way we imagine heroes today. He was a man of the frontier, rough, scarred, violent, and unyielding. But when the wilderness rose up to kill him, when betrayal left him for dead, when even his own body begged him to surrender, he refused. And in that refusal, Hugh Glass became more than just a man. He became a symbol of survival, a symbol of vengeance, a symbol of the human spirit's unwillingness to let go of life, no matter how impossible the odds. This was Hugh Glass, the man who would not die. Thank you for watching this story of survival, vengeance, and legend. If you found Hugh Glass's journey as gripping as we did, don't forget to subscribe and follow for more content. The wilderness is full of stories, and we'll be here to tell them.